Hello, and welcome to episode 143 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Denning in Los Angeles.
Jon, how are things in Los Angeles?
In Los Angeles? I assume they're okay, but I'm doing great. How are you?
There's a freeway on fire somewhere not too far from you.
Well, then I'm doing better than Los Angeles.
Yeah. The I-10 caught on fire yesterday.
Did it? This is how little I get outside, especially on test weeks, which I will be blaming all of my reclusiveness on. November has kept me hermited. That a word?
You got an excuse.
I think I probably do. I also have an excuse for the cocktail of today. Not that I needed one. But I'm drinking a big tall glass of one of my favorite whiskeys, Blanton's whiskey. If you haven't had it, I recommend it. Have yourself, 3 or 7. What are you up to?
Well, I'm not drinking Blanton's, I'll tell you that much.
That was a given. What are you drinking?
I've never had it, and I don't plan on having it if I can help myself.
All right.
But I am drinking.
I'll have to win some sort of bet.
What, to get me to drink it?
That'll be the stakes.
That won't be difficult. I mean, just challenge me, like, I'll give you $100 if you take a shot of it. I'll be like, I'll take a shot of it.
Interesting. That might be $100 well spent. Can make you a whole new man, Dave.
How much is a bottle of that stuff?
Less than $100, so it's probably not money well spent.
Good, then I can go buy some Kahlua and vodka.
All right. What are you drinking?
I'm drinking a Dark and Stormy, which is basically like a Moscow Mule, but with rum instead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's easy enough. Is there a reason you're drinking a Dark and Stormy? Is it your mood?
No. Yeah, I guess my mood is a little dark and stormy, but it is going to rain like heck here in Napa tonight. It's the start of the first atmospheric river, they say. So it's like, it's getting dark. It really is dark at this point. Feels apropos.
You're usually like a reliable Northwest weatherman, so I wondered if that had something to do with it.
You make me sound like my father. Great.
Not yet. I know a little bit about your father. You're not there yet.
I'm not.
You were gracious enough to let me pick I guess song is probably the wrong word for it. I vacillated, I wavered. There was a lot of good music that came out this week, and nobody died, so it was a little tricky. I went with Chris Stapleton's new album. I think they just released on this past Friday. I've been enjoying it. I know not everyone knows or is a fan of Chris Stapleton, but I certainly am. Have had the distinct pleasure of having some whiskey with Chris, 12 years ago or something in Nashville. I can attest to the fact that he's a sweetheart. And his album's fantastic, even if you don't know it.
I don't know it. I actually don't know Chris Stapleton at all. And I asked you about it, and then as soon as you said it was country music, I was like, well, that explains it all.
Well, I suppose it is country music, but it's a newer country music. I think it exceeds all genres. I wouldn't want to box him into a single. No,
we won't do that.
Okay. Well, if you've got some competition, I know the Struts just came out with a new album, one of your favorite bands, some guys you've actually had the pleasure of spending time with.
Yes, indeed, and I will see them at the end of the month at down in San Francisco at the Fillmore and say hello. But they just put out a new album called Pretty Vicious that is, I think, pretty good. I'm not sure that I've listened to it enough to make a full-on assessment. But I like several of the songs already, so that's a really good start.
There you go. I've known about their new album for all of a whole hour, but I do intend when we wrap this up to go listen to it, so thank you.
Go listen to the song Rockstar. That's the one my daughter likes the most, which is pretty hilarious when you listen to the lyrics.
Well, there you go. Assuming taste doesn't skip a generation, I assume it's going to be.
No, her taste is far superior to mine. Trust me on that.
So maybe it does. There we go.
I'm the generation that got skipped.
You
Get
got
out
skipped.
Of here.
Yeah.
Let's get into the LSAT world. Obviously, the big news there is that we just had the November LSAT. It just ended this past Saturday. It was a weird LSAT because it was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. I guess I can live with that early start, Jon, because 3 of the days are like regular work days for us. I still hate having Saturday destroyed, but I know that the lack of a Sunday test hurt some people because they needed more time during the weekends and they can't take off from work or school. So a little weird. I don't love that. I hope they don't do it too often. We'll have to see what they have to say about it.
Yeah, and for the people who ran into issues, of which there were some, as we'll get to, they're stuck taking a makeup on a weekday as well. So a lot of weekdays here.
Yeah, I don't love that. I wish that the makeup was on a Saturday. Given that they started this test that much earlier, it seems like they could do that. I will say, no matter when you take the November LSAT, whether it's the first 4 days or whether you take the makeup, you will get your scores back on Wednesday, the 29th of November at 9 a.m. That is just in time for you to register for the January LSAT if that's on your mind as well, because the registration for the January 2024 LSAT, which is on Friday and Saturday right now, January 12th and 13th. That closes the day after November scores come out on Thursday, the 30th of November.
Yeah. Can I just anticipate a question? And you're welcome to weigh in on this too. I hope you do. People keep asking me if January is too late in the cycle. I hear this over and over. My default is it's mid-cycle. It's not too late at all. Every school in the country, as far as I know, will take the January results. If you think you could even improve a point or two from here to January, take January. It's worth it.
Yes, and it's funny because that not only anticipated the question, but it anticipated what I was just about to say. It is not too late.
There you go.
So you and I are of one mind on this. It is really mid-cycle. If you go back 5 or 6 years, you might have heard people saying, well, January is a little late. The cycles have slowed down. The more uncertainty that you have with all these test changes, the scoring bubble that existed for several years with the high scores being inflated, they really slowed down because they didn't want to make too many early decisions. This year, there's a slight lack of applicants. It's like 1.6% less than it was last year, but it's closing quickly. A month ago, it was down 6.6%. And one of the theories that I've heard floated around is, and I think it's a good one, is that a lot of the problems with the August LSAT slowed down applications. And I think that could very well have, and the problems with the LSAT in general could be affecting the scores right now, which in the 170s are down about 7.7%. So test takers only down like 1.6%. High scores down 7.7. That's a discrepancy. And part of my belief on that is that all the little things that happen to people throw them off. Your proctor comes in and starts talking to you. Your proctor wants to move the mouse or says, I can't see your face. That really hurts high scores. It hurts everybody. Everybody loses points from that. But at a certain, everybody starts at 180 and you go down from there. And so literally it's just taking people down. And even if it just moves them out by 1 or 2 points, then they drop out. So I really don't know for sure yet. We'll have to see. It is still relatively early. But regardless, your question about January, January will be used by every school in the country, and it'll be more than reasonably situated from a timeline standpoint. Is it early? No. But is it late? Also no. Yeah. January will be fine, and you are correct. Even 1 point more on the January LSAT will be worth taking it again. Scores matter, not when you submit.
Perfect. I didn't know you were going to elaborate to that extent, but I'm glad you did.
I was in a mood for it, John, as you know.
I can feel all your moods today. I like
my aggression is high.
I like it. While we're in the business of talking sort of LSAT world stuff, let's talk about some of the free webinars that we have coming up. Because I know, and I hope you can maintain your aggression till the 6th, you and I have got a special one in mind. Should I run through the list?
I think that you should.
All right.
I'm up for it.
Yeah, for those who don't know, we are constantly running free webinars on all sorts of topics. You can find them at powerscore.com/free seminars. Go sign up for everything. Even if you can't attend, for the most part, you will get a recording link to the thing that you missed, but please try to attend in person because you get to participate and ask questions. The next one that we have on the docket, from what I can see, is on December 5th. It's the LSAT 101, which is a really good introduction for anyone just starting out. Covers the whole test, really breaks down each section in terms of what you need to know and how to best prepare for it. It's excellent. The one I'm certainly most excited about, bit selfishly, is the next day on December 6th. Dave, this is you and me. We're doing a crystal ball for the January and February LSATs, and as we will talk about a lot through this episode, these crystal ball webinars can be an absolute lifesaver. We're going to talk about how well we did with our crystal balls for October and November as we go through this. Spoiler, we were spot on. So I hope people are able to attend for the December 6th, January, and February preview. And I hope, my God, I hope we're as accurate as we have been here. Because if so, I will continue to get a flood of messages, as I know you have, that just are overflowing with gratitude. We appreciate that. Thoughts, comments? Should I keep going? All right.
No, I mean, I feel exactly the same way. Ton of messages. Very happy about the outcome there. I want to raise. That's the way it all kind of plays out.
We're both underpaid. I like it.
It should be $1 million for every single topic predicted correctly.
Well, that's you and I'd be on a boat somewhere recording this, I think.
We'd be retired by now.
Yes, sir. On December 19th, there is a webinar on basic conditional reasoning. Don't let the name fool you. It's a really important starting point for anyone dealing with conditionality. And given that you're still at that point, 8-9 months of logic games, it'll cover logic games as well. Some of the conditional rules that you'll see. So that's a really important one for both logical reasoning and logic games. And then at the beginning of the new year, on January 3rd, there's one that kind of continues that discussion, advanced conditional reasoning. That one's more focused on logical reasoning, but still a very important one. And again, kind of testing the upper limits of what conditionality can be.
Nice. So at least as far as you and I are concerned, Jon, I hope that anybody who's thinking about taking January, February, or both comes and joins us on December 6th for that webinar. And obviously, as you said, we'll kind of refer back to that a little bit tonight when we hit certain topics. But let's get into that November 2023 domestic U.S. Canadian LSAT. There was no international LSAT this time. So unfortunately for those folks, they didn't get a chance to sit down and take their own exam unless they flew to the U.S. or Canada, which is a big ask, I think, overall.
Yeah. But fortunately for us, it consolidated things a bit, as we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing about the international test is I wish they were completely separated out, just at an entirely different time, because it'd make it just a little bit easier to track them. But let's talk about what happened. I mentioned already that this test was Wednesday through Saturday. So let's take a look at the number of test takers each day, because I think that does play a role. The first day, Wednesday, was 4,200 people or so were scheduled. Not a big surprise. It's Wednesday. It's the first day. It's the middle of the week. That was the smallest day. The second day, Thursday, was the second smallest. That was 5,600 or so who were scheduled. And always those numbers who were scheduled come down because some people don't show up or they have issues, what have you. Then on Friday was the biggest scheduled day at 6,700. That slightly surprised me. And then Saturday was essentially the second largest of the days, and that was at 6,500 or so. So roughly, when you break it down, you're over 20,000 solidly after they lose all the people. You get some retesters in there, you're probably going to end up at like 21,500 overall having taken this particular test. A little not unusual to lose that type of percentage. And as you said before, Jon, if there were problems, and there always are, and we always talk about them, and this time they came in really two sources, which we'll address in just a moment. That retake is Tuesday, the 21st, and they're very rigid about that. They typically, some people say, I can't take it on a Tuesday, which is, I think, very reasonable. Like, I got to work. That's it. That's their choice. I don't love that. I would like to see them change that policy. Whether or not that's something that they will do, I doubt it. They seem to be satisfied. And then again, as we said, scores come out on the 29th of November at 9 a.m. Eastern. All right, so let's talk about those problems, because there are two types of problems that we solve. The first are what we call isolated, and this is something that anybody who follows me on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, has seen me talk about systemic issues versus individualized issues. We're always looking for systemic issues that affect a whole bunch of people all at once. We saw that in August. It was a massive failure. Thousands were affected. Early on, we didn't see those types of problems, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. What we did see was individual issues, where a proctor messes you up, or you get disconnected, or perhaps one of the most annoying ones, you take a break, and then the proctor never comes back and checks you back in. But random disconnections, things of that nature, these happen. I think they're terrible. I think they're hugely negative, especially if they happen with like 15 minutes left in the test, as happened to one person I was talking to, and they were like, I was doing great. I was loving it. I was rolling into the end, and then all of a sudden the test just disappeared, and it was nothing to do on my side. Those are bad enough, and we certainly know that the numbers are, I don't know whether it's 100, 200. It's really hard for us to say. They don't give us specific numbers. But we also know that on Saturday, around 4 p.m. Eastern, there was a server outage on LSAC's side, which usually means Microsoft, by the way, since they tend to use Microsoft products. And that kicked out or froze tests for many people simultaneously. In fact, as far as I can tell, it's not all, a huge swath of people. People at test centers were able to kind of get help to get back in. If you were remote, you had to call and they tried to get you back in, but we know that not everyone was able to, and it just froze you out. There was a problem with the server, and that was the case. So very frustrating to see that happen because it was towards the end of the last day. I don't think there were as many people testing as we've seen in some of the past, but all those people were harmed, directly by that kind of situation.
Yeah, I don't think it would be... I don't think it'd be incorrect to say it was hundreds of people. I don't know that it was thousands, but it did seem to be fairly global. I know people in person at centers, suddenly their system just shut off. People remote, ditto. So this was a big deal for those people testing Saturday afternoon.
Yeah. And the other thing is, going back to those individualized issues, the proctoring, I know that LSAC is working on this, and I know they put out directives, and they can even pulse out information during the test to say, hey, don't focus so much on somebody resting their hands on, their face on their hands or something like that, or it's okay to touch your face a few times. But it is really difficult to control that many proctors. And you see just some weird reports of creepy behavior, or, oh, I have your name here. You're a very attractive person. Obviously,
you should smile more. I don't know if any proctors ever said that, but that's, to me, the height of creepiness.
I've heard similar reports. I just want to say this. If that happens to you, file a complaint. Mm-hmm. You can tell them, hey, I'm going to keep my test. I was comfortable with it, but you should know that my proctor did this. They want to know. I'm well aware from talking to them that any kind of weirdness, strangeness, unwelcome behavior should be reported. They will take action and remove those people. So that's just something to keep in mind as we kind of go through this. Nobody needs to feel uncomfortable during one of the biggest tests of their life. Yeah. It's just not a fair situation. And I think everybody agrees with that, whether it's us, the person taking the test, or LSAC. Maybe not that individual proctor, but we can't control that person.
To their credit, I know LSAC does acknowledge and agree with these things that no one should be made to feel uncomfortable.
Facts. Yeah, they didn't ask me to say that, but I know that they would agree with it and be like, yes, we'd like to hear that. That nobody wants that. It's disgusting. So, all right, Jon, that brings us up to the actual discussion of test content.
Here we go. Are you gonna do the thing?
Of course, I always do the thing.
All right. I'm gonna do the other thing, which is drink.
Well, you drink. Oh, man. So, a few thoughts, reminders, disclaimers, all these other types of things. And again, I'll mix it up a little bit, and I'll also go fast through this. But this is really, I think, important, especially for those of you who have never heard us do this before. And I'm going to start with a note that I started with at the very end last time, which was a note for future test takers. When you take the LSAT or even a practice test, the best thing you can do if you've had an experimental section is to jot down some quick thoughts on each section for yourself. Topics that you had in the first LR, topics that you had in your logic games, topics that you had in your reading comp, topics that you had in your experimental, another LR, another logic game. This will help you sort things out after the test and figure out what was not scored on your exam. It'll also help you when we start talking about scaling and the scale matrix, and it'll avoid the confusion that we hear every time of, was my section that one? Mm-hmm. Don't just write down one question or two questions. That's not enough. Write down 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. Write down as many as you can in LR, and then each of the 4 in games and reading comprehension. Those people who did that will find this discussion much more useful because they'll have absolute certainty that was my section. Because we're going to mention both real sections and experimental sections, and then we're going to give the matrix for scoring and figuring out your scoring scale using just the real section. So you want to be as certain as possible with this. All right. That said, Jon, I'm going to ask you personally not to summarize this online. Also, everybody listening, I'm going to ask them personally to not summarize it online.
That's not for me, is it? All right. I won't.
I know. I just wanted to direct it at you for fun. It's too easy to miss the nuance of what we're talking about. This is a free podcast. Just send them here. It's easy enough. I'll also remind people that your section order is meaningless. It does not matter. When you start talking about my first LR was easy and my second was hard, and someone else says, gosh, I felt it was the reverse way, it's because it might have been the reverse way. The idea that section order is now something that makes a difference is dead and gone. 15 years ago, it would have been a big deal. We could have used that to figure things out. We no longer can do that, and that is part of LSAC's plan to make it harder to figure out what is real and what is not real. So, sections and orders and content change all day long. During the test, they don't want you talking about test specifics. So they allow people to talk largely after the exam. You can talk about generalities and topics, but they don't want you to post specific solutions or ask for the answer choices or what was right or wrong. They prefer not to have that. We typically abide by that. You don't see us talking about the test while the test is actually ongoing. We wait to release this podcast until the exam is done, and that is on purpose. And anything that people tell us in the meantime, we don't release that either. So just something to be aware of. Also, when we start talking about test difficulty, and it's going to come up tonight, just keep this in mind. Taking the real thing under time pressure, knowing that it counts, knowing that it goes on your so-called permanent record, always feels worse than a practice test or taking it on your home or taking it at the library or wherever you may actually be. This is a negativity bias that creeps into everything about the actual LSAT. Many people walk out and say, that was the worst test I've ever taken. I've never done an LSAT that was harder. That's probably not the case, and certainly wasn't the case for this exam. It just feels that way because the pressure creeps in. It darkens the edges of everything, so be aware of that. Also be aware that when we talk about difficulty, we think everything's hard on the LSAT. I don't think anything's easy. So if I say something's easier, it's a relative at a high level of difficulty. It doesn't mean I think it's easy. I just think it's on the easier side of hard. And then be aware that the test makers are trying to confuse you. They use the same kind of topic in multiple sections. In LR, for example, there were a bunch of carbon-based questions. Where carbon came up. There was multiple bone questions. I saw topics reused over and over again, and it can be really confusing if you're talking to your friends or after the test and saying, oh, I had that carbon question. Which carbon question did you have, though? We've seen this in RC. We've seen it in games. We've seen it in LR many times, so just be aware of that. Also, our estimations of what's real and experimental are based upon prior usage. If they previously used a section and we can determine with certainty that it was real, and there are many, many ways for us to determine that it was real or not, our belief is that when they reuse it, in almost all instances, it is a scored real section. So be aware of that. And you may not hear your section discussed tonight, and that is because we didn't hear from you, or you're not recollecting some of the topics or the way that we're describing the sections. This happens. Sometimes people come out of the test and they're like, it's a blank. I was talking to one student and they gave me very detailed information about the second logical reasoning section they had. They couldn't remember a single question in the first. And I could see their recollection matching up with what I knew about the section, but the first section they were like, nothing is coming to me at all. So that kind of thing happens. It's easy to blur out and to blank out after the LSAT, and I'm not sure that's the worst thing, whether it's alcohol-induced or otherwise. All right. Last thing, just as a reminder, please don't summarize this online. We really appreciate it. Just have people listen to the free, I repeat, free podcast.
Well,
John?
Well done. Well done. I do have some bad news. Given all of that, I think I'm out of whiskey. But aside from that,
so long.
Yeah. Aside from that sour note, nicely done. Let me reiterate one point that you made at the top, and I'm going to make it here at the bottom, which is we really can't overstate the value of when you finish a test, even practice tests. Write down everything that you can remember. Not only will this help you when we have discussions like this to better match up your content to what we talk about being scored versus experimental, etc., but it'll give you a better sense of self-assessment. I wish more people spent time on self-analysis post-test. Most people don't. They just see what they scored and that's that. But your ability to anticipate your performance, your ability to anticipate your score is really useful and will help, I think, alleviate some of the uncertainty, some of the demons that necessarily come along with this. So please take our advice on this. If you are going to take the LSAT again, obviously, if you're done, then you're done. But if you're going to take it again, spend some time right after the test, as much as it sucks, writing down some things, jotting down your thoughts, jotting down content, and jotting down a self-assessment. It's worth it.
Absolutely. And so with that, John, we'll get to the content that we were able to see on this test. And hopefully you will hear the sections that you had. If you don't, I would say send us a message and let us know. We can't report on what we haven't heard about. I think we have a pretty good span of content covered. I think we got it all. This was an easier test in some respects to figure out what was real. I think that was probably out of the last 6 or 7 LSATs, this was easier than almost others once we heard a section to know automatically from prior usage whether it was real or not. But if you had something that was different, please tell us.
Yeah.
Because we want to have complete records for this. That helps us not only help you get a kind of like a scale analysis, but also helps future test takers as well. So, John, I'll let you open it up.
Yeah, a big part of the reason I feel like this one was a little bit easier is because the majority of the content was in logic games and reading comp. We didn't see nearly as much variety with logical reasoning this go around. And logical reasoning is almost always the hardest section to identify because there's just so many topics. So that has made our lives a little bit easier here, despite the fact that, as we're about to see, there were 4 scored sections of logic games and 4 scored sections of reading comprehension. It's a lot. Let's start
16
with
variations by itself.
That alone, yeah, before LR even comes in. So, yeah, it's a bunch of moving pieces. I think we've got them all. But let's start with this, Dave. Let's start with the crystal ball. We did one of these before the October test, where we were, if you've listened to our October recap, largely successful with our predictions. But I'm going to make a bold claim and say that we were even better with our predictions for November. Agree? Disagree?
I'm not disagreeing.
Yeah, I didn't think so. I wish you would, because I'd finally win an argument. But
you want some debate?
On this? Yes, please. Please, I'd win one.
The difference here was that the crystal ball usage on the first day of the October test was minimal, whereas here it started off immediately. So you started seeing people make comments. And so the perception in October was, well, if I took the test on day 1 or day 2, it wasn't directly applicable. It was applicable. It just we didn't get some of the RC topics on day 1 or 2, but we did when the test continued on.
Yeah, that's fair.
This one was one where they used the sections that we had talked about, and the spread of topics was a little bit broader. So it ended up being, almost every day somebody saw something where we had talked about it previously.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I woke up Wednesday morning and Wednesday afternoon and immediately saw that, especially in reading comp, a lot of the topics that we had encouraged people in that crystal ball to go research and study were hitting. And in multiple sections, too. It wasn't just one section where we got, quote-unquote lucky. As we're about to discuss, several of the sections in reading comp were ones that we saw coming. And that was obviously, extremely gratifying. Let's start with logic games, though. And I'll start with what we saw Wednesday morning and just kind of run through. I'll also preface it with this. We did not see, once again, any experimental logic games. No surprise. But logic games are going away. Next August, there will be no more logic games on this test. You shed a tear. I'd pour one out if I had any to pour. But there is no more logic games, so they're not testing experimental logic games, these days at least, so far.
Yeah, and this is something that we've been talking about for months now, saying we don't see why they would continue to test experimentals of logic games when we know that they won't be using them in the future. I think we're going to see a more and more of a reuse rotation in logic games going forward here through the June 2024 LSAT. It is interesting, though, to watch what they did on the logical reasoning side, because there were at least 5 logical reasoning experimental sections out there, which is a huge number of experimental LR, and largely why you and I end up having to do a tremendous amount of work from Wednesday all the way through really this evening.
Yeah. If I find a gray hair, that's why. So there you go. I haven't looked all that closely, so maybe not. But there's a lot of LR. It feels like a playground, frankly. They're clearly finding ways to take some of this logic games, analytical reasoning stuff, and incorporate it into logical reasoning. We're not seeing it tested yet, necessarily, but we will. We're seeing it being experimented with.
We'll come back to that point, because I think it's an interesting one.
I think so, too.
John?
Let's start with logic games. So the first section of logic games, at least that I saw on Wednesday morning of this test, was a real scored section, as all of these are going to be, 23 questions, and this actually came as a reuse from content from the March 2022 LSAT. These were the 4 games there. And sadly, it started with a game where it seemed so straightforward that most people couldn't even remember the topic. I think it was about 3 lab pieces being tested.
Yeah.
I think. However, the next 3 games were very clear on. The second game in this section was about bands being scheduled in 2 different nightclub venue stages. I think a nightclub manager was scheduling bands. Tricky game. The third game in this section was also troubling for a lot of people. This was about apple trees in north and south fields. As soon as I saw this, though, Dave, I had to give you kind of a hat tip because this was something you talked very specifically about in the Crystal Ball. You're like, go study these pure grouping games, go study conditional games, because that's exactly what this was. You nailed that. Kudos. And then the final game in this section was about students attending lectures in 2 different halls on campus. I think halls like G and H. That was a tricky game as well. But on the whole, this was a section that I feel like people who were well prepared managed sort of handily. I don't think there was anything here that really caught anyone by surprise.
I don't know if, people weren't caught by surprise, but hopefully they weren't caught by surprise. I think still some were. The interesting thing, John, is this was the reuse of a March 2022 form. Mm-hmm. And that exam was one that you and I had targeted as being very likely to be reused at this time. So when we get to the RC and they use the RC from that test, you'll see that we told people to study up on several of the topics there. In the logic games, though, what happens is if I think a particular test is likely to be used, when I go into the crystal ball problem sets, I specifically look for games that have similar features. And in the crystal ball, I talked about a couple different things, one of which was being like heavily conditionalized games with a lot of chains. It was like, you've got to expect this. We've been seeing a lot of it recently. You've got to prepare for it. And so I chose games for the problem sets that have some moments of mimicry with the games that are on here. Another example was conditional sequencing, like A is ahead of B, then arrow, C is ahead of D. I was like, those types of rules. In other sections, we saw those types of rules being played out there. And so it's not that I can predict the exact, we could say that there's, apple trees in north and south fields. It doesn't help anybody in logic games the way Zora Neale Hurston helps people in reading comprehension.
Spoiler.
But if I know what type of game it is, all right, it's this type of grouping game and it's got north and south to it, I can go find games that have similarity because the past is prologue here for the LSAT. They just reuse concepts over and over again. Anyone who studies logic games can look at a new logic game and say, I see all the elements to it. Very few times do we see something that's relatively new, which is why a game like the September 2016 virus game is so interesting to us. It's like, I haven't really done that before. This particular LSAT really reuses a lot of basic ideas. Not to say that they're easy, but they're really foundational ideas around conditionality and so forth that if you have done certain games in the past, makes this feel easier. That's what the crystal ball is all about. So when I started seeing this test was in use, I was like, yes, this is going to be very good for our students. And I think by and large, this is not an easy section, but I think it was good for a lot of people.
Yeah, Wednesday had me smiling. I know it did for you as well. It wasn't the only set of games that we saw that day, though. There was another section of real logic games that kicked in pretty early in the test week. Also real, as all of these are going to be, 23 questions. These were actually from the June 2022 LSAT, another test that we had predicted was likely to appear, less likely than March. And as we'll see, March was used more often. But here were the 4 games from the June 2022 test. The first game was about bridges needing repairs. Second game was about debate teams, 2 debate teams, and it's kind of fun, for and against student uniforms at a school. The third game was
John,
about...
I got to interrupt. Are you for or against student uniforms?
Oh, I'm anti-clothes. So, yeah, right away you know my answer.
We're talking school uniforms, so that isn't an option.
I realize the context. I said what I said. I said what I said.
I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you because I'm generally not about authoritarianism. Yeah. I am 100% pro uniforms in school.
Really? I'm not even allowed near schools. So why are you so pro uniform? That really does surprise me because you're kind of an iconoclast. You're kind of a sort of standardization, anti-authority.
I don't like being told what to do, and I don't like institutions that try to tell you what to do. So yes, this is a little bit surprising. In this case, I think it's much better for the children. And this is the difference between having one, I think, and you not having one, is I've watched this, especially at a certain level, it takes away all this pressure to be like fashionable.
That makes
And
sense.
to have certain things where some kids might be able to have those things and other kids might not be able to. I don't want to put any kid in that kind of position. So for me, I think school uniforms are like, okay, this is you know what you're wearing or some variation. I'm not saying it has to be the same identical outfit all the time, but where my child goes to school, it's typically blue, white, or khaki that they're wearing, and they can kind of vary that, whether it's, a hoodie or a shirt or whatever it might be. And I think that actually just really makes it much more uniform.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. I haven't really thought about it that way, but like the haves and the have-nots get less distinguished or less easily identifiable. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
All right. Well, while we're clearly pro North Korea or whatever it is that you've just tried to institute.
Get out of here.
Should I start over with this section? The first game was about bridges needing repairs. How do you feel about bridges? The second game...
When they need repairs? I know actually a lot about that, so if you really want to go off on that, we can. I know.
You actually do know. You have a bridge leading up to your house. I know you do that.
I live by a creek, so I'm very familiar with bridges needing stupid repairs and the costs therein. So let's just continue on without talking about that.
Way sidetracked. I don't hate it. I don't hate it. Bridges needing repairs is the first game in the section. The second one about the debate teams and student uniforms. The third game, I would say arguably the hardest of the 16 games that were tested, I think, was 8 lawyers with different specialties. 3 were personal injury, 3 were medical malpractice, and then 2 were overlapping with both. Really tough game, if you saw that one. But the fourth game eased up a bit. It was 5 volunteers working events or shifts on a Friday and a Saturday. Those were real. That was a section a lot of people saw. And again, the source for this was June 2022 congrats to us, as predicted. All right.
I'm going to take over for the last 2.
By all means. And be sure to insert a lot of personal opinions.
Would you like that?
I would love it. I might be the only one.
I actually think the student uniform question is an interesting one.
I do too.
And for those of you who are like, please just get on with it. We're trying to have some fun with it because just reciting all these topics could really be mind-numbing. So the third section that we saw was, again, real, 23 questions. And this section I think was very reasonable. Moderate might be the right word for it. The first game was about 6 designers being assigned. The second game was about 6 movies being released over 4 weeks. Then a book club. A couple games with books, by the way, because the last section has books in it as well. But this was a book club, not bookstore employees stocking shelves. That's coming up. And this book club was holding 7 meetings. And then last, an interesting game about 2 people visiting 6 companies over 6 weeks. And so that was the entire section that was right there. That was scored. And that leads us to the final section, which, John, I think was probably the least used of all 4 of these.
For sure.
And I only saw it pop up with a few people, and they were typically paired with the same RC and scored LR, as we will talk about. But this section had attorneys in cases at a firm, presentations at a book club, so different book club, and then bookstore employees stocking shelves. And then finally, maybe the most notable game in here, travel guides giving tours in Uruguay and Venezuela in January, February, and March. So that section was used. That's actually, we've seen it multiple times. It first appeared as a scored section in October 2019. It was used again in April 2021. I was surprised to see this come out because it didn't really come out to us until really close to the end. But it is indeed a real LG that is scored. And usually the people who had that had a very specific RC that I'll let you get to here. But those are the 4 that we saw. No experimental. We really don't expect to see experimental logic games going forward. It'd be a big surprise since they don't need it anymore.
Yeah, why bother? I think that last section actually was first experimental back in, I want to say June of 2018, if memory serves. Yeah, I think that's right. Yep. So again, a section that we're pretty familiar with reuses. But there you go. Those were the 4 sections of scored logic games. We think that was everything. If you had something different, boy, are we eager to hear from you. Let us know.
We'd be surprised and eager.
Surprised and eager. Yeah, story of my life. Let's get to read and comp. which again had 4 scored sections, but there was also some experimental, as we'll get to. Let's start with the real stuff with reading comprehension. Wednesday morning, here's what we saw right out of the gate. Also from March 2022, 27 questions. These 4 passages are real. The first passage was about Samuel Beckett and strict play productions, essentially what he was like as a play sort of overseer, playwright, haunting playwright, I think was the phrase. The second passage was about the Mayan civilization collapse due to a drought. The third passage was about genetically modified crops versus traditional farming. That was the comparative. And then the fourth passage was about international intellectual property law, how it benefits economies. So there you go. If you had those, they counted. If you had 2 sets of reading comp, those are the ones that were scored.
Anything in there that we talked about in the crystal ball?
Oh, buddy, thank you for the alley-oop. Yes, indeed. I mentioned that people should go read up on Samuel Beckett. I think that's just a good principle, regardless. I love Samuel Beckett. But I specifically mentioned this Maya civilization collapse and drought. Told people to go research that. I talked about GMO crops and traditional farming in the crystal ball. I said, if you don't know what any of these words mean, you should go out and research that. So, yeah, this section was an absolute slam dunk.
And we've said this before. Right now, they're in a cycle where we can predict a lot of times.
I know what you're about to say.
Some of the topics that you're going to see. And again, we're not trying to predict everybody's test perfectly. It's an impossibility. I've said this many times before. Even getting one topic predicted right on the LSAT is like a 1 in a million shot. We've obviously lowered the odds when we're able to do something like this. This is a golden era. Take advantage of it while you can. It is not going to last forever. John and I are more than cognizant of the fact that at some point they will have too many options for us to accurately predict, but right now we can. So it's not a guarantee that it'll show up on your test, but if it does, it is a huge boon. And that's why we get these messages afterwards like, I can't believe it. I felt more comfortable. I knew a little bit about the general topic. That helped me then absorb the material faster, feel more confident, go more quickly. It's not that reading about Samuel A. Beckett is going to actually give you the answers. It's going to instead make it more easy to assimilate the information that is coming at you and to feel that degree of confidence behind you. That's why we do this, is to try to help people. When we're able to do it this way, I'm thrilled. If we miss it and you study things that weren't on the test, you know how I feel about it? That's good. Education is a good thing.
Yeah, you learn something.
Yeah, I will never feel bad about telling someone to learn something about something that isn't on the test ultimately, because it could have been. And if it was, it's like winning a jackpot lottery. Mm-hmm. If it's not, it's just a little bit of time invested, but even that's not a loss to me.
Yeah. Familiarity always helps. If you know a little bit about Samuel Beckett, you read that passage, you know 2 things. 1, you know a little bit about the topic. And 2, you know it's scored because we told you this was very likely to appear. Both of those are a huge asset. I got a message today, Dave, that I have to reference, and I'll keep it anonymous, but it was actually about the 4th passage in this section, and it was a gripe. It was a complaint. Someone said to me, you didn't tell me to study international intellectual property law. And I scratched my head for a minute. I thought to myself, what could I have told you? What possible thing could I have said that would have benefited you? Look, I can tell you to go study the Mayan civilization drought. That's useful. And some other topics, as Zora Neale Hurston and stuff that we'll talk about. But there are certain things here that we intentionally leave out of our recommendations because they are so generic. They're so sort of intentionally useless that it would be a waste of people's time for us to tell them to go research. So that happens too. We didn't fail to recognize that passage was coming. We knew. We just didn't feel like there was any real insight to be gained from trying to read about the incredibly generic international intellectual property law.
Yeah, I mean, it's also you just handed 3 lottery tickets and you're mad that you didn't get a 4th.
Yeah, well said.
So my sympathy level, and not to be a jerk about it, but I'm feeling bullish about it, is, hey, also what we don't want to do is say to people, here's 50 topics, and then say that it's volume that's allowing us to be successful. We could easily do that. We have every reading comprehension scored topic from the last, 20 years that hasn't been released. So we could totally do that and be like, this is every topic. That doesn't seem like the best use of time, though, because that would be really time consuming. That's why we try to hone it down to a grouping that we think is the most likely. If we can get any of those to hit, John, I'm thrilled.
Yeah.
if none of them hit, I'd be bummed out. It hasn't really happened. The day that it happens where we got nothing, I'll be like, that sucks. But I know it'll happen at some point. It's just not happening yet. All right. So
I like you today, man. Right to the point. Dark and stormy. Emphasis on stormy.
bullish.
You're going to hear the same thing. I mean, not you, listener. You're going to hear the same thing in this next section of real reading comprehension topics. We knew all 4. We predicted 3 because 3 of these were worth studying. Here was the next section of reading comprehension. 27 questions. These came from the June 2022 LSAT and got reused again as predicted. The first passage was about the history of jury selection in the 1300s to 1500s in England, one that we told you to go research. The second passage, Zora Neale Hurston. She's a choreographer. Specifically, I think it was about Bahamian fire dancing. Sounds fascinating. That's what I prefer to school uniforms. That would have been a passage that we told you to go research as well. The third passage, folk psychology and economics and natural sciences, that was the comparative passage. That, to me, is so blandly generic that we didn't even mention it. But the fourth passage we did, movement in gymnastics and a balancing experiment with robots, like the physics of somersaults. That was one I very specifically mentioned in the crystal ball. You can read up on this. You can actually learn a bit about it going into your test. And the people who did wrote me extensively saying thanks.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good point because we haven't really drawn this point out previously in having this discussion.
I'm realizing
why don't
we
just
talk through it? Yeah.
Why don't we just list all 4 of the passages in the section that is about to show up? Well, I mean, movement in gymnastics and robots is very specific. You do a search for that, you're gonna get a few articles where it's like, oh, that's interesting. Whereas something like folk psychology in economics and natural sciences, it's so broad.
Yeah.
That it doesn't have the same impact. And again, we're trying to use the time wisely. Maybe not in this podcast today. Being hugely expansive.
Don't be self-conscious about this. I'm having fun.
I'm
and if
not
there's anything that matters, it's that I'm having fun.
That is of high importance to both you and I. And it should be high importance to all listeners. Hopefully they're enjoying it too.
It's the reason we made it 143 episodes.
Yeah, seriously. But something like folk psychology, there's just not a huge amount that we can get out of that where we think this is really specific info that'll change the course of how you read this. What's in that passage is going to be good enough. Something like the movement in gymnastics or Samuel Beckett or genetically modified organisms and so forth, that kind of stuff is where you can really get a benefit from doing the reading. So that's really why we don't just list every little thing out there. And I think that's a point worth kind of like emphasizing.
Yeah, I'm glad you did. I'm going to move quicker through the next 2 real scored sections. So this will be faster, probably.
So you think?
So I think. We'll see what happens. We'll see what Dave's opinions are. The third scored section is, again, another one that was reused, although we didn't necessarily see this one coming because it's pretty obscure and pretty rare. This was from October 2020. 27 questions. These passages were real. If you had these, they counted. The first was on Duke Ellington, jazz conductor and his ensemble strategies. The second was on charity organizations, nonprofits, and philanthropy. The third passage, the comparative passage, was on religious symbolism in courts and government buildings. This was about like statehood representation, I think. And then the fourth passage in this section was on operationalism, some imperialist view on physical science. I think it was built around an experiment like measuring gas in a lab. So there you go. One that we didn't necessarily see coming. We didn't anticipate that, but I mean, come on, we're doing pretty good. There's a fourth. Yeah, you do you have a comment?
I was just going to say, that's, again, this is part of the thing. When you've got 4 different sections that they're throwing out there as real, we're not going to get every single one. Like I said, I'm happy to get one passage on any of the 4, and to get more than that is a victory.
Yeah. So 16 scored games, 16 scored passages. I'm about to get to the final 4. We've nailed at least half of them. That's pretty remarkable, if I do say so myself, and clearly I do. Here's the fourth set of reading comp. Real 27 questions. These are from the October 2019 LSAT. Kind of like the games I mentioned were from originally experimental in June 2018. First passage here was about jazz and Latin. The second was about volcanoes. This was glaciers, and sulfur and Indonesian ice core, and drilling techniques. I think it was the history of someone, I don't know, unraveling a discrepancy, as it was described. The third, and the one that I'd probably like to read most, was about motorcyclists camping and park managers in Banff. And then the fourth, intellectual property and ownership. That was the comparative passage to wrap that section up.
Yeah, notice another IP passage.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the experimental, we'll see copyright law play a role.
Yep.
What they're really saying is, hey, if you want to do well on reading comprehension passages that involve the law, go read up on the law in general. Specifically, IP law helps. That has so many different angles to it, really hard to recommend something specific to read, which is, again, why we typically are not putting that in kind of like the problem sets that we're recommending or the topics to go study.
Yeah, what can we do? Tell people to go study up on copyrights? I mean, good luck. You're going to law school. Yeah.
They should. I mean, it's super interesting stuff to me.
You're a strange, strange man. Here.
Yeah, well.
Here's the
Write a book.
Yeah, write a book.
You probably should know a little bit about it.
Here's the experimental section of passages that we saw. For what it's worth, I only saw one set of experimental reading comp. 4 scored one set of experimental. It's almost the inverse of what we saw with logical reasoning, which we'll get to shortly. 27 questions. These were primarily paired from what we can tell with the Mayan drought, civilization collapse set of passages. These were the 4 experimental passages. If even one of these rings a bell, this section did not count for you. The first one was about a study of 2 authors. I think one of them was Thoreau in his, obviously, novel Walden. The second was about consumers using goods to solve problems in creative ways. The third was about animal dreams and animal rights. And then finally, it wrapped up, as Dave alluded to, with a passage on copyright law. That was the comparative.
Is Walden really a novel?
I think so. What would you call it?
Novella at best, but is it really even a novella? I thought it was more like a...
It's not a poem.
No, it's more like a journal of sorts.
It's boring as can be, I can tell you that. I read it.
Well, we don't disagree there.
Oh, it made me want to go live in a cabin. It's awful.
Nobody thought they were going to hear a discussion of Thoreau's Walden here on today's podcast, but
I bet they're glad they did.
They're thrilled. All right. So that last one with Thoreau and copyright and animal dreams, that is experimental. I'm sure we'll see that again in the future. And that brings us to logical reasoning, which was really interesting because logical reasoning was really by far the most commonly used experimental section. So a lot of people had 2 LRs. We've said this before, that 2 LRs is a nightmare for people to figure out because it gets so jumbled.
Yeah.
It's 4 topics of reading comp, 4 topics of games. Really easy to kind of like separate it and like, I had that in this section or that section. 25 topics of LR in each one can be really challenging, and even worse when they start having duplicate topics among sections, like I mentioned carbon before.
Yeah.
So let's go with the very first LR that we saw a lot of right out of the gate. And this was actually paired with the remaining portions of the test that we saw from March 2022. I'll just read off a few of the topics. This is a scored real section. The very first question in the section was about environmental cars. Energy needed to build electric cars costs more than the damage of non-electric cars. There were multiple electric car questions, so don't get this confused if you had a different one. Another question in this section was about the bending of light and the theory of relativity as it relates to Einstein. Question about food trucks and vendors in a town. Question about gas tax and how it relates to and affects farmers. Another one about warm-blooded versus cold-blooded animals and dinosaurs. One about the marine fossil record and CO2 and mammals in the ocean. So again, carbon right there. And then another topic was about blood glucose increasing memory, which as a person who likes really sugary drinks, I'm all about that. That's why my memory's better than yours, John, is because I like to drink those and you're drinking whiskey.
That's entirely possible. I was going to blame genetics, but go for it.
All right, that section was real. 25 questions, if I recall off the top of my head correctly. Obviously, that's just a selection of questions in there. But if you had that section, that was your scored LR. Here was another scored LR that we saw floating around. Also 25 questions. This had a question about the DNA of yeast and mushroom and human genes. question about City Hall renovation and kind of like a poll on kind of remodeling it or not remodeling it. Question about vitamin manufacturers, and they're defending a study, and about placebos and the ethicality that's in there. A bunch of questions that really related to things about like really ethical natures, like someone choosing not to work at a company because that person sees themselves as ethical, but the company doesn't have a similar reputation. Certainly a question that a lot of people were talking about, that I'll call it the West African empires question, but really it was about articles and citations from a girl who was working on a research paper, and it related to the Jollof and Benin empires.
I think it's Benin, but yeah.
Is it Benin? I always thought it was Benin.
I think so.
I don't know. I'm not just going to take your word for it.
Well, nor should you, but I'm pretty sure about this.
This is like West Africa and like the Senegal area, so I feel like there's like 5 empires, by the way.
Yeah.
We're going to have to agree. Benin. All right. I'm going to go look it up afterwards.
Deal.
If there's anything that annoys me, it's not saying things right. But if I'm right, next time I'm going to come on this podcast and remind you of it.
Oh, yeah, let me have it. Yeah, let me have it.
Also a question in this section about bank leverage. One about obesity and dense foods and kind of how that analogizes to democracy and information flows. And I think this is also the section that has the question about the government funding a space station around the moon. That whole section, also real. And then finally, very easy to miss LR, that kind of was paired with that Banff reading comprehension and the travel guides in Uruguay and Venezuela. The logic games. This was an RC that has been used a number of times, originally in the February 2014 LSAT, used again in February 2021. It was on the June 2022 international test. This was given to very few people as far as we can tell, but maybe the most notable question here is one about babies and parents buying teddy bears, and they buy bears that look like the kids instead of actual stuffed bears. There's a question about buses versus driving, another one about exoskeletons, and another one about nutritional deficiencies in social programs, vitamins, and how that relates to social ills. So we don't think as many people had that third section there, but that too was scored, also 25 questions. Most people had the first or second LR as their scored. But insanely enough, John, I believe there were 5 experimental LRs that were on top of this. And normally we don't go through each one of those. And we actually have a tremendous amount of information about all 5, which is really gratifying.
Yeah.
But just to maybe help a few people who are concerned about like, I'm having a hard time separating the two, I'll just read a couple different sections. Maybe I'll cover 2 or 3 of these sections and just name a few topics that are not scored.
I'm glad you're going to do this, because there was a ton of confusion about this.
There was so much. These sections, these topics, if you had these topics and you can tie it to where it was on the test, your section was not scored. Question about grocery stores. Very complicated, which we'll talk about in a second, and knotted spheres and circles. Another set of questions about cracking eggs into colanders, Benford's Law, whether or not I think Nancy is tall after she gets a post-grad degree and how she's perceived, as well as the pyramids of Giza. And then a section that involved cobalt blue tarantulas, ivy is like a ground pollinator, and then hot water heaters, pinholes, corrosion, all that kind of stuff. None of that counted. So that last part does not count. John, what did you see in that experimental LR that a lot of people complained about?
Well, first of all, I think it's pronounced colanders while we're doing this. I know. Sorry, man. I mean, fool me once.
Yeah. No.
Had to do it.
You don't know anything about the kitchen or how to cook, so you can get out of here. You're going to tell me, I'm surprised you didn't complain about Uruguay and you weren't like, it's Uruguay.
You pronounce Giza right. Clearly, Dave and I are on our last legs here. So what did I hear people complaining about in these LR sections?
It's ridiculous.
I mean, the biggest issue, I think, was just the difficulty in identifying. That's what I heard. I didn't hear that any of these were necessarily like overwhelmingly difficult, except, and there's a giant asterisk on that, there does seem to be a clear indication that the test makers are beginning to import more formal logic and like intensely dense conditional reasoning. That grocery stores question that you referenced as an experimental was almost mathematical. It felt almost like algebraic or something. That one about the knotted
numerical concepts.
Yeah, the one about knotted spheres and circles in that same section with grocery stores was just another mind bender for a lot of people. So that's, to me, the biggest feedback that we got from logical reasoning. It wasn't that the scored stuff was all that unique or difficult. In fact, as we're going to talk about, it was pretty run-of-the-mill and predicted by us. But the experimental logical reasoning, man, it wrecked people. What was interesting to me, too, Dave, in this is that it's dicey to look at something on this test and say, that felt weird, so I bet it didn't count. But in the case of logical reasoning this go-around, the sense of strangeness was actually a pretty good indicator that it wasn't scored. And that turned out to be the case. We wouldn't go on that, but a lot of people's instincts were correct.
Yeah, I think what happened here was, and this bears watching. We know 2 LR are coming. Is their plan to now try to amp the difficulty up in the future to offset logic games? And the way to do that is to include more formal logic, more heavy conditionality, more mathematically based type of questions. Could possibly be that way. Am I convinced 100% yet? No, of course not. It's very early. However, will we be watching it? Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of those things where it really... It will take some time to figure this out. If we start seeing LR section after LR section that has these types of features, then we'll know that this is something to expect when the new test debuts in August of 2024. But it's not as if we can't go back in the history of this test and find some really brutal formal logic questions, some really brutal conditional reasoning questions. I mean, go do the brown dwarf question. It sucks. It's horrible. It doesn't really matter who you are. It's tough. It's also not recent at all. So they do exist. Were these one-offs or is this a pattern? That's what our job is. We'll keep tracking that as things go forward.
To me, this is a sign of things to come. I don't want to scare anyone who's taking the test in 2024, but to me, it's not so much a shift in difficulty, it's a shift in emphasis, where it just seems like they're leaning more into the analytical reasoning side of what logical reasoning can be. That's my take.
Well, if you think about it, one of the theories and one of the things they tested as a replacement for logic games was to have an analytical reasoning section that was much more formal logic and light games based. Yep. This was one of the possibilities. So if we know that they tested that and ultimately rejected that as a full section option, it's not that much of a leap to think, well, maybe they'll add some of those concepts in with a bit more emphasis and frequency going forward. So I don't think that's like, oh my gosh, what an incredible insight. It's more like they could easily do that. Let's keep an eye on them. That's why we do this.
I think that's very fair. Yeah. Certainly was interesting to see. This is the first instance where it's been, kind of in your face with what they're doing experimentally in logical reasoning. I fully expect them to keep it up, by the way.
Yeah, I'm much more circumspect about it, unless you think I'm saying that word wrong. I'm going to go ahead and just be like, let me just see, because I don't have to make a decision on it right now. I don't even have to make a prediction on it, but I can just sit back and watch. We've got multiple more tests coming through in January, February, April, and June. We'll get our opportunity. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to break down the matrix now.
I have no notes. There is part of me that wants to emphasize one of the syllables in circumspect, but I'm going to let it go.
Yeah, well,
you can guess which
just
one.
Missed matrix, so I mean,
I know I caught it.
You're not on your game, man.
Nah, when it's intentional, I'll let it go.
This is the scoring matrix discussion that we're going to have. This is the breakdown of how we feel the scale will be affected by the relative difficulty of each section. And the way that it works is we focus on the number of questions you can miss to get a 170 on this test. And we typically start as a baseline saying you can miss 7 questions to get a 170. So we're going to talk about all the sections very briefly that we just went through, but keep this in mind. You want to listen for each of your topics in logic games, then in reading comprehension, then in logical reasoning, and say, all right, I started missing 7. Does it affect it? Does it keep it the same? Does it loosen it from 7 to 8, and so on? So for each one, we'll go through all the scored sections. You just listen for yours and then add it or subtract it or have no effect on that 7. Keep this in mind, especially with this test, because I'm not sure people are going to be thrilled with what we did with logic games.
People are about to be upset.
Yep. We're always conservative. I would rather say to people, hey, the scale is 7 and it actually is 8, because that'll raise their score slightly, than to have it be the reverse way. And we are extremely aggressive about that. So if you think there's any possibility that it is 7, or it's, not moving it versus loosening it by 1, we will say that it does not move it. I would much rather be wrong on the conservative side, at least when it comes to scoring scale matrices here. So let's start right there with logic games. 3 of these sections have appeared before, and so we're going to use the scaling that we used on those previously. The first one was the bands on stages, the North and South apple tree fields, the 2 nightclubs, the teacher and lecturer. When we've talked about this as recently as March 2022, we said that this does not move the scale. Could somebody argue with me and say, hey, it moves it a half? Yeah, they could. And I would completely be reasonable with that to say I could see that being the case. Again, given the choice of being conservative or not, we're going to take the conservative approach here because that's the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. So if you are at -7 and you had those logic games, sad to say you're still at -7. The next section was the June 22 section about bridge repairs, debate teams, lawyer specialties, and work shifts. 23 questions. As we predicted previously, we say this is 0. It also does not move your scale. Then there was the new section about designers, 6 movies, the book club, 2 people visiting 6 companies. I think it was F&G visiting those 6 companies. This is a new section, but our take on this, and we have a lot of information on it, is that it is a moderate section, also does not move the scale. Do I think this section was easier than, say, the apple tree section? I do.
Yeah.
So I can see some effects from apple trees downscale specifically, less so here. Again, this is the nuance that we like to talk about. If we were talking about scores to get a 160, I'd probably say the apple trees moves it more than this section did.
I would say that about lawyer specialties.
Fair enough. For some reason, I'm just using the apple trees as the comparison.
It's all right. We're on the same page.
All right. The last section, originally from October 2019, we don't think as many people had this section, but this was the one about attorneys, the book club, then the stocking the shelves, and then the travel tours into Uruguay and Venezuela. Also, no effect. That's what we've talked about that section before. So 3 of these sections we've actually covered previously. But the thing is after all that logic games, I know some people will not be happy, but there is no movement on the scale in our estimation. Sorry. Let's go to RC, because some of these will move it. And the very first one is one that we've talked about before. This is the international IP law, the Mayan collapse due to drought, the genetically modified foods, and then Samuel Beckett in his plays. This is a tough section, 27 questions. This is going to loosen it. So if you were at 7, you're now at 8. The next passage set was the jury selection, Zora Neale Hurston, folk psychology, and gymnastics and robot. This is not going to move the scale in our estimation. So if you were at 7, you would stay at 7. Same thing for Duke Ellington and the charity and philanthropy and the religious symbolism passage set. Also, we think that does not move it. So you're at 7, you stay at 7. The last one is going to move it, however, and this was the one about the national park Banff. There was about the volcanoes and the ice cores, the intellectual property and ownership, another 27 questions. This was difficult. This would move you from 7 to 8. So at this point, everyone is either 7 or 8 questions missed to get a 170. That brings us to our 3LR. All right, 2 of these we've talked about before, and we've kept the rating we gave them previously. The first one was about the environmentalist cars, the blood glucose, the gas tax, the trade restrictions. The first of the LRs we talked about. We don't think this is enough to move it. We think in a lot of cases, the experimental sections were harder than the real scored sections. And I think that's really the best news for people, is that each of the scored sections was like, oh, I thought that was easier than my experimental. That was largely what we heard. I'm not saying for everybody, but for many people. This is not going to move the scale. So if you're at 7, you stay at 7. If you're at 8, you stay at 8. Same thing is true for the set that of LR that had the West African empires of Benin.
Nailed it. I love that I can still educate you all these years. I hope I'm right. But if I'm wrong, there will be a formal
That's derisive laughter from me. And Joloff, the vitamin manufacturers and the bank leverage section also does not move the scale. I'm actually like so offended I'm coughing. And then the last section of LR was about the babies and the teddy bears, the exoskeleton, the bus versus driving also does not move it. So everybody, if you were at 7, you stay at 7. If you're at 8, you stay at 8. That's all of the basic scales. Now keep in mind, that's for a 170. Can there be movement around the number of questions to get a 175 or 165 or 155 and so on? Absolutely. The nuances of what we were doing are not really easy to kind of convey in a podcast. We can see the high level difficulty the most easily out of all of this. And so that's why we're able to historically be very accurate and always close with these scale predictions. When you get into, say, the 150s and the 160s, it starts moving around a little bit, becomes much more nuanced. We're not making claims about those particular scales, but I feel decent about the above. And certainly, I realize for some of you, just having the LR news is good, and that's what you wanted. It's less about the scaling at that point. Remember, it's all about how you feel about the test. If you feel comfortable with the exam, don't worry about the scaling. Just focus on your own performance. Yeah. And regardless, on Wednesday, November 29th at 9 a.m. Eastern, we will all find out how things went.
Yeah. I like that you pointed out the fact that we're conservative, because to me, if we have missed anything here, we've probably missed a point too low. If we said it was -7 or -8, chances are good if we're wrong, it's -8 or -9.
Absolutely.
Everyone can be happy about that, except us. So,
yeah, if somebody came in and it was like, well, that 7 test was actually 8, I'd be like, I'm okay with that. If we're going to miss, let's miss in that direction. Would I prefer it to be 7? Do I think there's a chance that they could all be 8? Sure.
Yeah. In the hierarchy of how we rank these things, I think we prefer, number 1, to be right. But number 2, if we're going to be wrong, this is the right way to be wrong.
Correct. And it's difficult, especially with this much LR. It really, I think a lot of our energy was focused on that. I did not expect 4 LG and 4 RC and 2 LR. Yeah. Technically, that gives you 32 different variations of test forms. There weren't 32, though, because we didn't see the last LG, RC, and LR mixed up with the others much at all. So I don't think
for instance, that third logical reasoning that was scored was extremely exceptional. It didn't happen for many people. Rare. It was only married to certain RC passages, for instance, so from what we can tell.
Yeah, the interesting thing is if you look at this historically, once we realized that they were using that Banff RC and that they had paired it with the travel tours, LG again to Venezuela, we went looking for the LR that it was paired with, and this was the LR, and we got reports that, yep, people had this particular question set. So usually they got all the same content, which obviously limits the number of test forms that are out there. As always, though, just a massive amount of information to track. If you didn't hear your section or you have questions about it, send us a message, especially if you didn't hear your section. Like, I had this, and I don't think it's one of those. We'll check and see whether or not it matches with anything or whether it turns out that we just hadn't heard from you beforehand, and so we couldn't report on it. We're always about getting the information, even if this is over and done with. Jon, aside from, your apparently amazing ability to know how to say every word correctly.
Thank you very much.
Anything else to add?
Should we leave it on that? What I was going to say is if you didn't hear your section, just assume it loosens the scale by 3. You're welcome. Congratulations. But do please let us know. This test to me was in many ways well predicted. Congratulations to us. But at the same time, I feel like there might be something floating around out there that we didn't hear about, that escaped notice, in which case we'd love to know.
Yeah, I can tell you that you and I were both debating the fact of at a certain point, we're like, only 2 LR doesn't seem right.
Yeah.
We can't have 5 experimentals and 2 scored. We felt like there had to be a third one out there. It did appear eventually, but the usage of it was so limited. I'm like, I still don't feel comfortable with it. If somebody was like, no, I had a totally different LR and that was the only one I had, I would not all of a sudden be just amazed by it.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked. I'd just be disappointed because we would have loved to have known, 2 hours ago.
All right, Jon. On that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a comment or a rating. Next podcast episode is almost assuredly going to be an admissions mailbag, so send us questions if you have those. You can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. On behalf of Jon and myself, we hope this was helpful. We hope this was great news, and we're really looking forward to hearing how you did when you get your scores back on the 29th of November. Best wishes to everybody. Stay safe out there.